first I want to congratulate all of you for the book, and I was very lucky because most people normally are ordering the books and wait for them to come. I managed in this conversation to order the book that I'm wanted to read, and basically it happened. But the story is the following, at least for me. In IWM, what I was seeing was that there was a very interesting Polish debate about populism that in a certain way was extremely interesting when you put it in a context of this very popular talk about populism where you're going to see everywhere. For three reasons that I found particularly interesting. One is that in Poland it started quite early, in 2005, 2007, basically was the first electoral victory. But also because a normal debate on populism very much stresses the economic sources of it, and particularly the effect of the global financial crisis. And from this point of view, Poland is very interesting because there are major economic, social problems and others, but honestly speaking, Poland was a country in which global financial crisis was not particularly felt. There was no recession. You cannot go with the explanation that you can basically go in many other countries. Secondly, there was these two different trends. One in the beginning, particularly talking about populism in Central and Eastern Europe, very much a simply Central and East European phenomena, which I didn't believe was particularly the case. And then when the global debate started, then people started so much talk about the global phenomena that some of the particularly distinctive characteristics in different countries have been lost, and particularly Poland and Hungary have been put together, which I also don't believe that really clarifies. I do believe much more than confused. So then when we have been talking to Karolina, I asked a much more simple question. I said, tell me, what are the books that have really triggered public debate, not simply academic debate in Poland about what is happening, how the politics is changing. And when she was telling the story of all these books that we're seeing, and what I found particularly interesting was that this book are coming from a different kind of a methodological, but also ideological perspectives. But this was a debate of the generation of people who basically are younger than 50, let's put it like this. I don't know the exact age of the people, but this was kind of a post-solidarity intellectual elites. And for me, this was very interesting because I do believe that in Poland, you have something that I'm missing in all other Central and East European countries, which is an intellectual debate, which is both academic and political, where the younger generation, all kind of different positions are very much represented. And for me, this was a great value, and to be honest, also pleasure to read the book because I learned a lot. And there's three things that I took out, and I'm going to end up because, as you know, I'm the one that knows least about everybody, about what is going on. The first is that I do believe it was quite interesting to see that in all these different essays, in a different way, the authors were trying to put this kind of a global dimension that we see a certain type of a transformation of the democratic politics together. So it's not a kind of East European or Polish exceptionalism, but at the same time very much insisting and trying to find this historical, be kind of a particularly social context in which the Polish phenomenon, and particularly the Kuczynski phenomenon, makes sense. Also some of the intellectual forces. The second thing is that I believe that unlike many other books for which writing about populism is much more defending liberal democracy from populism, here you can also have in many of the, I do believe in all, in fact, of the essays, a very legitimate, in my view, criticism also to the performance of the liberal governments before and basically to the transition period as a whole, and also to the strategies of the liberal opposition now, why it's so difficult to respond. And I'm going to end up with something that for me is the most interesting in all this polarization story, which for me, Poland very much resembles the United States. So the story I see it is the following. You have a society which, if you're reading the opinion polls, is quite pro-European, and the rule of law, obviously, is perceived as a value for the majority of the people. And then you have voters who are not going to punish their own leaders when they're going to violate the principles, be it European affiliation of Poland, be it the rule of law, because they start to believe that the worst thing that can happen to democracy in Poland is the other party to win elections. And from this point of view, how the liberal institutions can survive in a politics, how you can reconcile the Schmittian understanding of politics as friend and foe. And Jan is here, and I do believe he knows about Carl Schmitt and probably very few people in the world today, how the Schmittian understanding of politics is eroding, not simply institutions, but is basically also shaping the opponents of populism. In a certain way, when the populist discourse starts to dominate, being anti-populist in many ways pushes you to adopt some of the language, some of this kind of a polarizing perspective, and what is going to be the long-term effect of all this, not only for Poland, but I do believe general for the liberal democracy. So I'm going to stop here. I was very privileged to be the first one to read the book in English, and I'm very grateful for you for making it possible.
Thank you so much, Ivan. And I would now have the following idea for what awaits us. I would like to ask every author for a very brief statement as for the main argument of the essay that is contained in the book. And then I would suggest that we ask questions, and perhaps even there will be some discussion between the authors, because they also, as Ivan stressed, they also come from different ideological views. But I don't think different ideological camps, by the way, which is interesting for the generation that we are representing here in the book, because I'm not sure whether this is generational or not. But as for the institutions that are represented by the authors, they will discuss with one another, and there is the difference in views is not personal, which is extremely important in our polarized country. So the first question, the first person I would like to speak is Jarosław, because his essay is the first in the book, and then I will ask Stefan. So Stefan is preparing, and how do you take the floor?
Hello to everyone. It's a pure pleasure to be with you all via Zoom, and I think that we have these very short introductions. So it means that quick 5 minutes to 7 is all that we are allowed. And starting with myself, I will refer to what you, Ivan, has just said in your introduction. You've mentioned this crucial word, at least for me, the generation. The generation. Of course, in many cultures, including Polish, the generation as a political, sociological, and so on and so forth term is one of importance, but in our political circumstances, when we use perspective that is rarely used, view proposed by legal historians or historians of law and state, could be really helpful to understand some points that are not really seen from the outside. What I mean? I think that we are talking about the crisis of law in Poland, the crisis of the rule of law. Usually we tend to forget that, in fact, when we are talking about the law, we should also at the same time ask simultaneously about the condition of the state. We cannot simply talk about the rule of law without asking about the state. And here I refer to my book. I wrote it partially in St. Antoni's. I wanted to have it published in 2018, so as to have at least one counter narrative to the official commemoration of 100 years of Polish independence that had its anniversary in 2018. And for me, the point of departure was very basic, was that, in fact, during one of my courses at the university, I realized while teaching the history of law and state, I realized that it's absolutely incredible that it's the first time since the 18th century that guys behind me, that the students were born and brought up in their own sovereign country. Nothing of that kind happened since the 18th century. And one could say what it has to do with our quarrels about the law and justice, what it has to do with our problems that dates back to 2005, 2015. Well, I try to argue that, of course, it cannot explain everything, but at least it could highlight some very interesting points about the quarrel that still is mainly focused on the rule of law issues. So I think that we tend to forget that and here Polish exceptionalism is not for me any point of reference. I treat it as a case study. In Polish case, we have the culture that is reproduced in public schools, but also in private schools. In fact, it is the bulk of the Polish culture that was produced in the 19th century and 20th century that creates a kind of Polish mindset. And when you ask yourself what it means to the attitude towards the state and the law, it is absolutely fabulous to think that it is against the state and mainly not really for the rule of law. One could say that, again, we are at the very high level of abstract speculation, but the point is that I could give you a whole set of tangible examples from the current politics, even now, even during these elections, that the political language is highly influenced by these examples that refers to what I call the occupation mentality. That in fact, Polish political culture is mainly constructed by this against the foreign state, against the foreign law attitudes. And in Poland, we have the first time, perhaps, because I have to make a shortcut here, it is perhaps the first time that we have an opportunity to make a shortcut, to seize the opportunity for the discussion, at least, about the change in culture that should, to some extent, take into consideration that for the first time since the partition of Poland, since the 18th century, we are in our country and therefore we are lost in the sense of our attitude towards law and state. I've mentioned you that I could give you some examples from current politics. Suffice to say that the law and justice regularly uses the language of regaining the state. One could say what it means. In fact, since 2015, they are in power. But the point is that the language is there. Andrzej Duda is talking about regaining the state. He is talking, you even mentioned that some phenomena could be similar to the United States. True, definitely, we have a lot of similarities. But when we are talking, when we are talking about the differences, obviously Trump would not refer to the anti-communist rhetoric. Andrzej Duda did it in this campaign again, even if this had absolutely no sense in terms of reality of the highest court and so on and so forth. So I think that cultural codes is something that could be treated as a cultural filter. We have global phenomena, we have global wave of populism, we have a lot of similarities, definitely, but we have these filters, cultural filters, that are sometimes difficult to be seen from the outside, that are very often not really taken seriously into consideration by ourselves. But in fact, they are of importance. We are using some, we have the trauma, and here I would like to close this short introduction. We have the trauma of the collapse of the state, of the fact that it could happen again. This is highly illiberal, but it's really the Polish political language on the side of the peace, the law and justice, on the side of the opposition. It is in the language. When we were talking about, just to give you one example, when we were talking about the Brexit, about Polexit that should be modeled on Brexit, it meant absolutely something different. In Polish circumstances, it meant that you will return to the geopolitical situation of the pre-1989, and therefore it meant you will be under the influence of Russia, Moscow again. So it means something definitely different from very superficial similarities with the cultural notion of Brexit. We have this trauma. This trauma should be treated seriously. I think that it is shared on the whole spectrum of the Polish political scene. And to make a liberal ending, I believe that it is perhaps the first opportunity since 200 years that we could see that generational change is also a cultural opportunity. If the big question mark is if it's going to be taken seriously, here I am not so optimistic. The 200 years of Polish culture is absolutely powerful point of reference for us. So maybe a modest start to make a discussion about the state, our attitude towards the state, but the real one, to the rule of law, that since 1989 followed mainly the Western patterns. So it was relatively easy. We had this post-communist myth of the West that was, again, widely shared, widely believed. But after 25 years, we founded ourselves on the uncharted territory. And here is a moment of crisis, but it could be also perceived and seized as a moment of real change for the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Jarosław. And I will now ask Stefan, because Stefan Sękowski wrote a book which is called No Change. So when Jarosław is talking about the chance of breaking with the vicious circle of Polish habits that come from our history, then I think instantly about your book and how you recognize also a quite disturbing pattern of habits always repeating themselves in the history of Polish transformation or post-1989 Poland. So Stefan now, and then after Stefan, I will ask Maciej Gdula to present his argument.
So I started to write my book sometime after peace started to govern Poland, and one of the goals of writing the book was to look if the positive change which peace told us that will happen after 2015 really happens. And of course, I don't mean that after 2015 there was no change at all in Polish politics. Of course, there were many changes, legislation, new institutions were founded, others were captured by the ruling party, but especially people who vote for peace, if they see what happens, they often don't see that the politicians of peace are are filling the shoes of their predecessors, because many of the pathologies were also present during during the time when the Civic Platform and the Polish People's Party governed Poland. And I mean such things like for example, also capturing the institutions. When we talk about the Constitutional Court, that what happened after the end of 2015 and on the beginning of 2016, the beginning was May 2015 when the Civic Platform and other parties voted for some judges who actually shouldn't be elected to the Constitutional Court. It was too early for them. That is one example. I could give also many others. But when PiS told us that they will break up with these pathologies, they didn't make it. But what I mean with no change, what changed, that for example the laws. Recently, I wrote for Nowa Konfederacja an article about rent-seeking and the political rent in Poland under the rule of PiS. And of course, I see that for example, when the ruling party gives money for pensioners quite by accident shortly before elections, or when I see what happens with state capitalism in Poland and the state-owned enterprises, I see the change, but it's not the positive change, and it's the same pathologies which we had before. Will we have them in the future? When I see, for example, but what is the problem with what is the why do we have the same pathologies again and again? I think one of the problems is that the until tomorrow politics. We don't have, politicians don't think they think only about the present and perhaps the next election term, not about generations. I know that one of the candidates spoke often about this problem, that what I say is not a statement of who I was voting for or something like this, but it's really a problem. And I think many people, but unfortunately not as many to change the system, see this problem. The polarization of politics, the conflict is beneficial for both of its sides. PiS and the Civic Platform see that they don't have to discuss real problems in Poland. I don't know if we will have a debate before the second round of the elections. But when we won't have the debate between the candidates, it will mean that we even don't, that we talk about the problems now, for example, but the politicians of the main parties don't talk with each other about the problems. When I see Rafał Trzaskowski, who presented his program at the last day of the election campaign, I am thinking I'm wondering if the opposition really has some ideas how to change the pathologies which were deepened through the last 5 years. And I also present in my book some positive proposals how to change it. Of course, they are not very concrete, because I'm not a politician. But first, I think we need the restoration of the idea of politics as prudent care for the common good. I know it can sound something naive. I know that, for example, the public choice theory tells us, and it's also true, that people want to maximize their profits through politics. But we as citizens should know that, understand that our real opponents are not people who are using to people who vote simply for other parties, but people who use the state for their own interest. This is first. Second, we have to reestablish a middle class in Poland. I understand it as people who earn their money with their own labor, but on the other side, they have also property to survive without being at grace of their employers or the state. So we have also we should also have some legislation, an economic system which promotes the society of owners. Third, we should also promote a civic society which can care for itself without the interference of the state. I don't mean that we don't need the state, and also many public goods should also be given to us through the state. But when the civic society cares for itself, the price which the politicians, the cake is smaller than in a situation when the state cares for all the people and for all the public services. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. So basically, both Jarosław and Stefan have this argument that what happens to Poland is basically a continuation of something that has been present for a long time. So when Jarosław is talking about the trauma of the collapse of the state, which is to some extent repeated by what Jarosław Kaczyński is doing, and at the same time it is also repeated in people's fears, the ambivalence in how they see the radical change Jarosław Kaczyński is bringing to them. So this is quite psychoanalytical, I always thought. Stefan is rather talking about pathologies that are deepening. So instead of improving the situation is actually deteriorating. So the Jarosław Kaczyński's Poland is something like a sad decadence of the Third Republic. It's not the Fourth Republic. It's like a degenerated Third Republic. And I would like now to turn to Maciej, who on the contrary says in his essay and in his book, no, this is something new, what is happening. We have not seen this before. Maciej, would you take it from me? You are on mute.
Right now, I think I'm unmuted. Am I?
No, it's fine. No, it's fine.
It's fine. Great. I would like to start by expressing my deep gratitude towards Iwan and towards Karolina that they made this book a reality. I think it's a great achievement that that you took the reflections on Poland into one book that can be presented, of course, to English-speaking audience, but also for the Polish-speaking audience that will have everything in one place. I think it's a great idea. I have 5 minutes, and it is a long time comparing to what we have in the Parliament. Usually we have 1 minute, maximum 3 minutes. I will try to make whole book into short statement. First of all, I made a study, a sociological study, in a small city called, which is called Miastko in my book, and this study was supposed to investigate the populist hypothesis. What I call the populist hypothesis is that people are voting for populist politicians because they suffer. The people down there at the bottom of society are suffering mainly because of the economic reasons. So they suffer because of the poverty, because of unemployment, economic exclusion. And this is the first element of populist mechanism. And the second one is that they cannot express their suffering in the public sphere. They do not have their own proper political representation. And that's why, it's the third point, they turned to populist politicians who are expressing their suffering and combining this representation of suffering with their own anti-minority, nationalistic agenda. This is the populist hypothesis of populist mechanism. We made this study in Miastko to reflect on whether it is really functioning like that. So we made, first of all, biographical interviews with the people in small town where law and justice had enormous political record of 50% of the voters supporting this party. And the second round of the study was to speak with those people about politics. And making a longer story short, what we discovered is that people are telling about their lives not in terms of being an object of external forces, not being an object and someone who is suffering, but they were presenting their lives, majority of them, they were presenting their lives as achievement. And also, they present themselves as being subjects of their own life stories. So it is very far from what in sociology we call trajectory. They are not into their life stories were not trajectories. They were proper biographies. And when we compare this to objective indicators of economic growth, like the decline of unemployment, increase of real wages, we cannot accept this populist hypothesis, this populist mechanism. There is no real suffering, either in objective or in subjective sense. So what is happening, in fact, and this is the second part of the study that is devoted to Polish politics, and we came up with alternative hypothesis of neo-authoritarianism. What is neo-authoritarianism? First of all, we emphasize that there is an important bond between the people down there at the bottom and the populist politician that is based on experience of power, experience of being a mighty person. This power, this experience of power is of crucial importance, according to me and the crew that made an investigation. It is the main thing to understand why Law and Justice is that popular, in spite of pathologies that were mentioned by Stefan Sękowski. People know that they steal money. Of course, they are stealing money, but they are powerful, and they are acting powerfully towards whom? Towards the old elites and towards minorities, towards refugees, towards LGBT, and they are doing this constantly. I think that nothing changed deeply from 2017 when we did our study. In this campaign, they are acting against LGBT people, and it is the mainstream politics. Why I'm saying it is not only authoritarianism, but this is neo-authoritarianism. This is neo-authoritarianism because it is not about how institutions function. It is not about how legal system is organized. It is not about how people behave on the personal level. It is very far away from this idea of authoritarian personality of Adorno. It is rather rather focusing on the specific bond and experience of power. We are becoming powerful because our leader is acting powerful against the elites and the minorities. And the second thing, why this is neo, because it's very democratic. This is really highly democratic system because they are not seeing the leader as someone who knows the spirit of the nation. No. He is, we voted for him. He is elected by majority. He is representing, he is legal because majority of people are voting for him. So this is something that I think somehow refers to what Iwan Krastev said in the beginning, that the problem of liberal opposition turning into populist or of these tendencies to be illiberal when you fought with populists. I think that there is a common ground, and this is democracy for that moment on. This is democracy. They are Law and Justice is still a democratic party. They express their faith in democracy, their faith in voting, their faith in elections. And for example, they are saying that the increasing part of the voters, that take part in the election, this is something that legitimates their governance. And they are saying it almost each time that they are accused of being anti-democratic. No, we were elected by the majority. And this is also experience at the bottom. People are not, for example, very interested in regulating democracy. They are, the Law and Justice voters were saying, okay, we live in democracy because you still can criticize government. And I think I think it is some hope for us. Thank you. Oh, I was longer a bit than 5 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you, Maciej, but I will not act like the speaker in the Polish parliament.
Yeah, thank you. You are very nice.
We can be nice here.
Unlike Vitek.
Exactly. I remember because this kind of plurality that we have in this book is something which is very typical for Cultura Liberalna, and we had previously, 1 or 2 weeks ago, a webinar on Facebook in which the conservative intellectual Michał Łuczewski actually said he feels in our discussion like in heaven. So I do believe that this is a little bit better than the Polish Parliament right now. The last speaker will be.
Does it mean he felt that?
He felt like in heaven. Yeah. The last speaker will be Tomasz, whose essay from all the essays that are contained in the book, and also whose book is the most concentrated on solutions of how to get out of the present crisis. And it has something to do with the political quality that has been created by peace. But I will now give the floor to Tomasz himself.
Thank you very much. This is a great pleasure to listen to your statements and also to discuss these matters with you. So I have a short time too, so I understand that this is a summary of the summary, because the essay is the summary of the book. So my argument, in essence, has 3 parts. And one thing to observe is what Maciej Gdula has already mentioned, that the notions of democracy and pluralism were important themes in Kaczyński's rhetorics for a very long time now. Even if we think that he might not be the champion of democracy and pluralism, this is not to be easily dismissed, because he was able to use the language of liberal democracy against itself. So it might be important to understand just how the trick is done. Another thing is that Kaczyński's radicalized over the years. So in the 90s, he said that he wanted to create a moderate Christian Democratic Party. The project failed, and then since 2005, he understood that he should build a national populist coalition to win. In the 90s, he thought that to build a national Catholic party was the shortest path to secularize Poland. But in recent years, he wrote in his book that he should build politics purely on national Catholic identity, because this identitarian moment or theme is something that his political camp could be organized around, and also this identity could be put in the polarization with another set of identities that he would oppose. So here I outlined the two main features of his politics or his method. One being concentration of power, and the second, radicalization of political conflict. So the mix of these methods, I argue, results in a dangerous political dynamics, because concentration of power provokes social protest, which leads to the radicalization of conflict, which provokes more concentration of power in response in the name of security. So we are in a kind of a vicious circle here. And this is a point in which the word populism, which is, of course, the theme of some of the essays, but also a catchphrase for what's happening in Poland and in other countries today, may become problematic in public debate, because it reinforces the idea of a polarized political scene. And if Law and Justice has a structural advantage on this scene, the talk of populists may reinforce their strength simply. If one side is called the populists, then naturally the other side may start to look like the elites, which is precisely what Kaczyński would want. So it looks at first sight as though you'd need to argue for pluralism, but here too come all sorts of problems. And there is a reason why I mentioned that it was Kaczyński who argued for political pluralism and legitimate political conflict in the past. Because today, Law and Justice politicians often argue that it is them who broaden the scope of pluralism against the Western liberal hegemony. So I will not go further into this theme, but this is just to point out that there are a lot of rhetorical, complicated stuff going on here. So here comes the second part of the argument, which deals with the question of what the liberal opposition needs to do in a situation in which this nativist populist political power dismantles the rule of law, liberal democracy, and so on. So in general, I would say that there are two main possibilities depending on the circumstances. Firstly, if we work against a firm liberal democratic social background, then the obvious choice would be to expose the wrongdoings, because this would discredit those who break the rules. So this would be the default position of the Poland's opposition in the past 5 years too. But this strategy was largely ineffective because it wrongly assumed that since Poland has a liberal constitution, Poland has a stable social background for liberal democracy, which was not the case actually. So in the post-communist order, I argued the liberal norms were to a large extent a product of historical dynamics and external pressures, such as that of the process of turning away from the authoritarian communism and joining the Western institutions. And what was needed then was a step from post-communism to liberal democracy, which would solidify those institutions for a situation in which the external pressures begin to vanish, as was the case of Poland after Poland had finally joined the Western structures, a moment which reopened the sphere of political possibilities for the future. So the second scenario in which, the second scenario would be one in which two things need to be done. And firstly, just as in the first scenario, we must expose the wrongdoings, simply take the law seriously. But secondly, the liberal camp needs to offer an attractive political agenda, simply to win voters and argue and work to build liberal democracy instead of taking it as a given. So thirdly, how to do this? And this is, of course, a fundamentally a strictly political task. So in the third part of the argument, it is not posed in terms of a political tactics, because then I would need to argue from the standpoint of a particular political party. But I consider more in the abstract, in the sense of themes that we can work with, the question of how to go forward, how to create a stable liberal democratic order which could stand on its own legs without the essential help from the external pressures. So mainly I argue that liberalism in Poland should evolve in response to its three main weaknesses in the past 3 decades, which are its anti-political nature, which disturbed the relation of the liberal camp with democratic politics, then its inherent conservatism, which made liberal ethics dependent on Catholicism, while the church has in the meanwhile become supporter of law and justice. And then thirdly, its economic dogmatism, which disabled the liberals from looking beyond free market orthodoxy and adopt a wholly pragmatic position on the questions of the economy. And this last point is probably rather important because, for example, with regards to the reactions of the liberal camp to the politics of social benefits introduced by law and justice government, too many in the liberal camp would scorn the beneficiaries of these policies, which only reinforced the view in which the liberals only stand for the elites. So all in all, I called this position pragmatic liberalism, hence the title of the essay. And that's all from me for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tomek. So I would like to ask you for your comments and questions now. Whatever you would like to share and whatever you would like to ask to authors. You might raise your hand simply, or put a question in the chat.
Okay. How do we? Because I have a question to Maciej Gdula, if I may.
Yes,
regarding his very interesting presentation, because I would like to ask Maciej Gdula about the relation of a theoretician in the case of his book and the practitioner and the political campaigner during the last elections. I mean, did your insights from the book actually inform the political campaign of the left during these elections? How would you comment on this?
I have one additional question. Are you asking about the presidential election or the parliamentary election?
Well, both.
Both. What I was proposing in the book was to abandon the language of the critic of law and justice as being anti-democratical and present other different experience of power or different experience of governance. I was saying that if we want to combat law and justice, we have to define a different vision of society based on respect against contempt, based on inclusion against hierarchy, and based on international cooperation, not of against against the international conflict, especially with Germany and Russia. So when I look at the last presidential election or ongoing as a presidential election, I think that on the side of opposition, it was the campaign was totally different than it used to be last year. That it was not only anti-peace, anti-law and justice rhetorics, but all the candidates were trying to define new political order, or new political society, let's say. I think that it was strong in Biedroń, of course, the left-wing candidate. It was very strong on the side of Hołownia, that, in my opinion, was mimicking. This was mimicry strategy. He was mimicking left-wing language. He is former conservative that has converted towards social democracy and liberalism, and of course it is present in Trzaskowski. So. Maybe I should be more moderate and say that the book was just stimulated the discussion, etc. But I think it changed something. When I look at the main oppositional candidates, I see that they are trying to introduce this what I was proposing at the end of the book. Of course, when I'm being in politics, I see that you are not an owner of the ideas. Unfortunately, I would love to Biedroń to be in the second round, but he's not. His mine ideas were stolen by Hołownia. They were stolen by Trzaskowski, but I think that they are present. I don't know what you think. Of course.
So if I might just make my question more particular, I was thinking about the part of your statement in which you said that from your interviews in Miastko, you thought that people would not think that they are some kinds of that they are not disadvantaged by the existing political and social situation, and that they needed this connection to power, and that they needed to feel empowered and to feel proud of who they are and what they do. So my question would be whether you were able to turn this insight into an actual political agenda and rhetorics in your political activity.
I was trying to introduce some kind of politics of recognition against the politics of contempt, and to some people who are not as strong supporters of law and justice. It was welcomed with acceptance, I would say. Last time when I was having a conference in Krakow, the old lady came to me. She started by saying that I should leave politics because I'm too good, and you are too good person to be politician. You should be out of it. But then she said something important. I liked what you say, what you just said about dignity. I think that that there should be more recognition in our society. Kaczynski is doing too much contempt. and she was not a left-wing voter. She was just saying she was a like normal, not very politicized old lady. So, and those are the moments that I believe that this politics of recognition, the politics that criticizes the politics of contempt, hierarchy, conflict, that it is worth something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have a comment coming from Joachim Rogall, and then perhaps just after the comment, a question from Kacper Szulecki, and then perhaps we'll let the authors answer. And I also saw a question from Iwan Krastew. So Joachim, would you start?
Thank you. The discussion and the articles were extremely helpful for me. And from the German perspective, our view on Poland was at the beginning that it is a sort of political accident. And it's like the same in Hungary and in Poland. It's a political accident and we should just wait and ignore it more or less. And then it will improve or repair itself. Mm-hmm. And what is obvious to me is that what happened in Poland is really a sort of new normality in politics, which the West will have in similar forms also in the future. The old the habits of political landscapes and the old rules of politics, even in Germany, have ordered. We have also new movements in politics, and that makes it extremely difficult for the people in the West because they are insecure. They are feeling that they are walking on sand. And Poland is, for me, really the laboratory Iwan Krastew described, because we will have similar experiences in the West. And it's interesting how the Polish cope with it. And we can learn a lot of it from your experiences. And so this discussion and these articles were really of great value, and I'm grateful that we have in English now the possibility for non-Polish speakers to get more information about this internal developments in Poland. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. 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 Would anyone like to respond to that? Or perhaps Kacper?
Right. Can you hear me? All right.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding the word democratic, because as Maciej Gdula pointed out, peace voters, they perceive themselves as kind of empowered by this majoritarian democracy, and they see peace as a very, like, an extremely democratic political force. You know, I live in Norway, so when I have to explain Poland to Norwegians or basically Westerners, I always emphasize that Poland is not an undemocratic country. It's more a hyper-majoritarian democracy. And this word democracy becomes a problem in a way. Recently, there was a map published after the presidential elections, I think by Gazeta Wyborcza, so our major daily, which counted the votes in different regions, contrasting the votes cast for Duda against those cast for, it said, quote, democratic candidates. And of course, you know, using this sort of language is absolutely infuriating for peace supporters, because they feel, and rightly so, I think, you know, that 8 million ballots are basically cast into the bin as undemocratic, and somehow the other 8 million ballots cast are better, more legitimate, whatever. So I think, to me, this is a cliche from 1989. Actually, that plays into what Tomasz and Jarosław are saying in their essays, which is that 30 years on, we keep reenacting dissident anti-politics, and kind of this is a cliche of saying, you know, the ruling party versus the democratic opposition. So my question to everyone, all the authors, is what word would you use to describe, like one single word you would use to describe all those challengers to law and justice power, which would not be democratic because obviously it doesn't work, a word that will capture this and will not antagonize the voters of law and justice?
Who would like to have a take on that? Jarosław.
Yes, thank you. In fact, Kacper, I'm thinking of that since I've been thinking of that since quite a long time, and I think we all do. I've got the impression that mainly that's how I try to explain that we have at the same time we have one notion of democracy, but in fact, what is powered into, we have two different liquids that we are using in Poland. I oversimplify, but these two liquids comes from different times. First liquid is 19th century liquid of majoritarian democracy. And I think that this is exactly what people supporting the law and justice have in mind, with whole honesty. What is enough for them is to experience of democracy, of majoritarian democracy, that in fact is pre-Second World War scheme of democratic life. So you don't have the ombudsman, you don't have the you can get rid of the constitutional tribunal and so on and so forth. All because the second liquid is the liquid post 1945. This is the second notion of democracy and democratic life, with all those institutions that we know are reaction to the experiences of January 1933 and so on. So I think that and in Poland, in Polish political discourse, you have both. And this is like a permanent misunderstanding, because you have supporters of the law and justice, sometimes lawyers, who with the whole belief, and I don't have any reasons to doubt that they are really do believe in that, that they are experiencing democracy in this 19th century style. And I don't know if it's like catching up for the lost time, or this is a Polish way towards some kind of democracy, because that's what we are hearing now, especially during the campaign, that there is a special Polish path towards democracy, and that's a very easy label just to tell that we are on this again uncharted territory, because it explains you absolutely nothing. But at least on the level of political discussion, you have these two understandings of democracy in Poland, at least.
Stefan also wanted to address the question. Tomek, am I right?
Yes.
Okay, now Stefan and then Tomek. And we have some more questions coming up.
First, I agree that we shouldn't call the PiS government an authoritarian government. PiS is a illiberal democratic or hyper-democratic party. We have that's a majoritarian democracy with weakened checks and balances. But when we talk about the opposition, perhaps we should call it simply the opposition, because the parties about which we are talking are different. Their voters don't really see them as themselves as a single camp. The elections to the European Parliament, when the opposition parties were going as as the European coalition showed that the voters of the opposition really don't see it as a single camp. Of course, after we had the elections to the Senate, where the candidates of the opposition gained a majority in the Senate, but I think the parties, the politicians of the opposition don't see themselves as a single camp. The civic platform or the civic coalition is more very strong opposition party or coalition. The People's Party wants to see itself as something in the middle. The left has also their own agenda. So, and we also have the Confederacy. So that's also an opposition party. So I think we should name it simply the opposition. And Gazeta Wyborcza is a medium which I think is very emotional in that conflict. It represents, I don't want to be ageist, but I think it represents and writes for many readers who Karolina told it in an interview for Nowa Konfederacja that they see this situation as something what attacks their biographies. So Gazeta Wyborcza is very emotional, and I think we shouldn't repeat these emotions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stefan, for mentioning emotions.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is a subject very close to my interest, and I do believe that when we talk about populism in Poland, it is as if there was a dialogue of feelings of loss, and obviously the liberal opposition is a group of people who have something profoundly lost, and I think it's a very, very important dimension. But I don't want to take the floor for too long. There was a comment or an answer from Tomek, and then I have 3 more questions by Ivan, Timothy, and Anya. And so please, Tomek, take the floor, and then we'll have the questions.
Okay, so thank you. Very shortly, because as an author of a weekly column, I have to often ask myself the question that Kacper posed, how to label the opposition, and I have been guilty of labeling it the democratic opposition. And but my first question, when I hear Kacper's question, is on what grounds would his question be legitimate? I mean, why is he so fearful of calling the opposition democratic? Because for one thing, the Law and Justice camp often describes itself as the independence camp or the patriotic camp, which implies that the other camp is unpatriotic and is pro-dependence of Poland to other forces, and they don't really have a problem with that because they understand that this is a political struggle, and who wins that struggle holds power. So I yesterday had an interview with Stanley Fish, the philosopher some of you may know, and I asked him quite a similar question, and then he responded that the right is interested in winning, while the liberals are interested in truth, and they want only to win when they tell the truth. So I think that maybe you want to be too truthful with regard to what the word democracy means, but the word that you should use actually is the word that would the most resonate with the audience that you want to address.
But excuse me, it depends, I think, on if you are a politician or an intellectual or a researcher or a journalist. The politician is talking what he wants. It's pure. It's a pure fight, yes, and we want to understand the truth. I think it's not only something what differs. It's something that differs politicians from researchers.
Can I quickly specify?
Yes, you jump in, Kacper. Yes.
The reason why I'm looking for an alternative word is that I think using the word democracy actually has the counter effect, in the sense that it mobilizes the peace voters to, it creates a certain outrage, and also it puts the opposition in an uncomfortable situation in response to this. Whereas I think that you might be able to find a word which would, rhetorically at least, limit the possibilities for peace. So kind of in the same way as using the word total opposition against the opposition has narrowed down kind of the political field of maneuver, I believe that there might be some kind of an alternative that could actually do the same for the opponents of peace. But yeah.
But I believe that the problem persists. That I don't know whether I would completely agree with Stanley Fish, but that the liberals would basically like to be right, and they think it's enough. Well, it's not enough. But I have a list of questions here, and if you allow me, I will gather the questions now because I have three. First from Ivan, then Anya Hoffman, and then Timothy Garton Ash.
Yeah, I just want to make an observation, which for me is very interesting, and it comes from what Maciej was saying. You have people who neither subjectively nor objectively see themselves as losers, but they get empowered, and particularly they get empowered, they have the feeling that they're winning by voting for peace. How this goes with the idea of the recognition. And my story is that part of the idea of the recognition, as we are talking, is that people expect just their legitimate concerns to be acknowledged. But I do believe that what Kaczynski and other populist leaders, by the way, Trump is very much in this case, recognized this. In order to have the feeling of the winning, you should see other people losing. And this is what makes basically this type of politics very different. Because the strengths of democracy, and this is why I do believe democracy was so kind of easily accepted by our societies in 1990s, was that in democracy, liberal democracy, when you're losing, you're not losing much. You're not losing your property, you're not losing your life. But the dark side of it is that when you are winning, you're not winning much. And then comes this idea of victory. Mm-hmm. And I do believe the interesting story, if you see and compare, and from this point of view, Kaczynski, Orban, Erdogan, Trump, who are otherwise very different, but they're very strong in one thing. I do believe for them, they treat their voters in a way the sport team treats fans. So it's not based on ideology, it's not so much based on a certain agenda, but this is type of we are winning together. And when basically your sport team is winning, this is not going to affect your salary, but you're going to feel kind of much better for a certain period of time. And this kind of a democracy of fans, opposite to the idea of the democracy of citizen, where you can be critical towards your own party, I do believe this is the major change. Yes, more of these people have said, I don't like particularly peace, but voting for them, I'm punishing those who I really hate. And I don't know how the politics of recognition, in the way basically this is known on the classical story, is going to be effective against this idea that my recognition based on humiliating somebody else.
Thank you so much, Ivan. And now Anya. Anna Hoffman.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also for the last observation. I think it's a perfect introduction to the topic that I would like to push a little bit forward in the discussion. And it is about the language also, and the question of recognition. How do you describe the reference? Because we are talking since 1 hour about the normality, the new normality that might be like a kind of laboratory in Poland. And we always have this reference that I'm missing. Is it democratic or undemocratic? As Kacper said, this is like everything is about democracy. And if you look at the language that we use, like Polish habits, something maybe unusual, or pathology was quite an often used language. And I'm quite curious to know what is the structural elements behind. Are we looking at this model of parties and opposition and supporters in terms of having a normal model liberal democracy following, I don't know, Western Europe, following some of the structure that used to be, or are we defining something much more universalistic that could be also used for other countries? And I have one very specific question to Maciej Gdula, and I was always wondering, why did you call it miastko, which is really, for me, like a Polish speaker, quite a pejorative name. I was really wondering, you went to this place, to this small city, and you were really interested in talking to people. You talked to so many people, but like designing, describing this place like miastko was really like feeling, something pejorative and not recognizing like the political agency of this group. And I don't know, how is your feeling about what happens on this division between big cities? We see it in every election since many years, like this disparity between urban and rural areas, big cities, small cities. So not only in Poland, but also in other countries, so many differences on that line. We all come from a big city probably, and we live in big cities. And what about small cities? How do we call them, and why miastko? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And Timothy Garton Ash, you took the effort lately to watch a lot of Wiadomości TVP, I believe, and I was wondering whether your question refers to that. To anybody who did not read the essay of Tim is in The Guardian.
Thank you, Carolina. I barely recovered. Yes, well, it's very nice to be with you from the miastko of Oxford. And the main reason I'm on this call is to say congratulations to Carolina and Jarek and all of you, because I'm really looking forward to reading the book. And we do badly need it, because I'm constantly being asked, what should I read? What book should I read to tell me what's going on in Poland? And it's very difficult to find one. I have two comments and a question. Both comments actually are about the language of winning, or the language that will win, which we've just been talking about. If you want to win, it's not always a great idea to start by saying that you're losing, right? And this takes me to apocalyptic book titles. I mean, I'm very much in favor of liberal self-criticism. I've done a fair bit myself, but the end of the liberal mind, really? Ivan, The Light That Failed, really? Brilliant book, fantastic book. Now Anne Applebaum was going to be on this call. The Twilight of Democracy, really? What follows twilight is night. I mean, I understand why we're all in a crowded market of attention. These grab attention. I hope they sell lots of copies. But there is a danger in that of talking ourselves into a kind of fatalism, just as in the 1990s with book titles like The End of History, we talked ourselves into a delusional triumphalism. So I just put a gentle cautionary note on apocalyptic book titles and fatalism. I mean, let me remind you, Germany, France, Spain, and Italy, to name but four, all have heads of government who could plausibly be described as small L liberal. The next president of the United States is likely to be Joe Biden. The next president of Britain, Prime Minister of Britain, is likely to be Keir Starmer, who is a very left liberal social democrat. Last Sunday in Poland, by my count, somewhere between 46.5% and 50% of voters voted for candidates who could, in a broad sense, be described as small L liberal and certainly respected liberal democracy, right? If you take Trzaskowski, Biedron, Hołownia's vote, if you add Kosiniak-Kamysz, you're up to 50%. So that doesn't feel to me like the twilight before the dark night. And this takes me to my second comment, which is this whole conversation about the word that appeals to the emotions. So I actually think this is what's going to happen on the 12th of July is one of the most important elections in Central Europe in the last 30 years. I think it is a kind of high noon. And of course, as we all know, the issue is not who wins. The issue is that Andrzej Duda and PiS lose, and therefore are prevented from having a clear 3 years to do Orbanization a la Polonaise, right? So I think it's incredibly important. In a sense, I feel we should all be out there knocking on doors rather than having this conversation, although that's a bit difficult to do from Oxford or Vienna. But as you say, for my sins, I watch a lot of TVP, and I also regularly watch TVN. And I feel that the opposition, Trzaskowski now, really is suffering from this problem of not having the language that really appeals to the emotions and the emotions of the swing voters, right? And to your discussion about democracy, I'm sure that is not the language to speak, because populism frames the issue as democracy against liberalism. That's exactly how it's framed, as we all know. So it's very difficult to reframe it as democracy against non-democracy. But I'm very disturbed that liberals don't talk more about our core value, which is liberty, let me remind you. That is the core value that liberals have in common. Why doesn't the opposition talk more about, dare I say it, wolność, right? Jarosław Kaczynski recently talked about demokracja niewolnościowa as being a possibility. Why doesn't the opposition come back and talk much more about freedom, or find those other words that really appeal to swing voters? And I'd love any of you to comment on how you think that language would work, or what other words over the next 10 days could actually swing the 2 to 3% of voters. Finally, to my question, and it picks up what Ivan, but what others said. Polarization is, of course, a phenomenon of our times. But in my view, looking globally, the US and Poland are probably the two most extreme cases of absolute bipolar disorder, of polarization focused essentially around two political parties. So take Britain, from the miasco from which I'm talking. We were an unbelievably politically polarized society, right? Brexit, 4 years of Brexit debate, people were saying, it'll be like the American South after the American Civil War. A half century, it'll just be Remainers against Leavers, right? The COVID virus hits, and suddenly all that vanishes away. There are no longer Remainers and no longer Leavers. There was real national solidarity. Explain to me. I understand why in the United States, because we know the specific history, which has to do with a two-party system, which simply will not be broken, and which is part of every aspect of life, of media, of the judiciary, of culture, of every aspect of life. But why in Poland is this bipolar polarization so stubborn and resistant that even in a moment of national crisis, like the COVID challenge was for most of us, it was still actually worse than ever?
Thank you so much, team. From my side, thank you for mentioning emotions. My take on that is in the conclusion of the book. I try to suggest that the main emotion which should be addressed and which has been already addressed by the populists is the emotion which is a consequence of a deep change change in the meaning of changing people's habits, their friendships, connections with other people, ways of life, the change which is a consequence of a long-term, a long-durée transformation, political transformation, social transformation. By the way, not only taking place in the context of Central and Eastern Europe, but basically actually taking place all over the world due to acceleration of our communication, technological progress, etc., etc. And I do believe it's a great challenge to address the feeling of loss. If this is the dominant emotion, of course, if I'm right to call it the dominant emotion. I do believe we have.
So what's the magic word?
How do you mean the magic word?
You pose the question, what's the answer? Because one answer would be for liberals to talk more about the nation. I think a great mistake liberals have made over the last 30 years is not to talk enough about the nation, to leave the nation to others.
Oh, yes,
because that is a community, that's a spunota.
I do believe that you're right. And I also do believe that, well, but you know, in order to do that, the liberals would have to first understand that they do not, they cannot refrain from emotions anymore, that they have to translate the feeling of loss into emotions like, for example, responsibility, patriotism, but liberal patriotism, etc., etc. So I do believe that there is an intellectual and emotional process to be made here. But I would not like to dominate the floor with the dominant emotion. Why don't we now make a last round of answers to the three comments and questions by Ivan, Anna, and Tim, and make it the last round. So at the same time, perhaps also we could try to make it a conclusion. Who would like to start?
So you can go also emotional because this is the last round.
Oh, of course. So Stefan wants to start, yes?
I would like to answer two questions or comments. First, I would like to answer Timothy Garton Ash. When of course, I don't live in Britain. I see it from outside, but as far as I know, it doesn't matter which party is in the government. You have Her Majesty's government. It doesn't matter which party is in the opposition. It is Her Majesty's most loyal opposition. I don't say that you don't have the polarization because you have monarchy,
the Queen,
but the Queen. But I think perhaps it's you don't have this whole delegitimizing. I don't know if there is such word in English, but in Poland, you know that the whole the party system is a community, and we have two parties who say about their opponents that they simply don't have the right to reign and to be. Yes, well, that's why I have the problem with, for example, speaking about the democratic opposition, which also means that that peace is undemocratic, because when you are not a democratic party in a democratic system, you don't have the right to be part of the game. When the peace talks about the opposition, about the politicians who are German, in fact, or Russian, then it's also delegitimizing. It's telling that the opposition has no right to be. We are the one who have the right to reign, and perhaps that is one of the problems, which of course there is no real I don't see why we should have such a polarized. I want to understand it. Since years I want to understand this. Why we have such fights about communism 30 years after communism, for example, and perhaps that's the problem, that both parties gain votes because they talk about such differences which actually are not important anymore. They are important in people's minds, but they don't say anything about the reality. And but on the other hand, and that's my answer to the comment of Iwan Krastew, voters behave like football fans or even hooligans. But why now? Why do we have such a high frequency now, for example? Why? I think there must be something deeper than just the purpose to let them loose. For example, the voters of peace, I think they really can be frightened when the opposition comes again to power. They will take back for example, the benefits for children. That's what the politicians of peace are talking all the time about. When the civic platform comes again to power, then they will take back the benefits, and they will probably do other things which will attack the welfare state in Poland. So and on the other hand, the politicians of the opposition frighten people then that if peace will win, then the democracy in Poland will end. I must say that before the 10th of May, when the elections had when the real election had to be in place, when I looked how the elections are excuse me. When I looked what the government, how the government prepared the elections, then I was also a little bit frightened how it came to if the elections will be legitimate. When the elections won't be legitimate, perhaps there is a way to authoritarianism. But the opposition talks about authoritarianism all the time. And I think such emotions are also very important in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Maciej asked whether he could be the second.
Can I? Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I have to leave because I have another meeting. Sorry. I will briefly excuse myself for using miasto. I will explain why I did this. I was rather thinking about creating the name that is in certain sense kind name. And to contrast it with the authoritarian tendencies. So it was not supposed to be a very demeaning name, miastko, rather it was a category close to small is beautiful. But that, like the really nice name, miastko. The second thing, the question of Timothy Garton Ash, why we are so polarized. I think that the great deal in polarization do the media. I think that the media infrastructure in Poland is very much polarized. I mean, we have governmental media and oppositional media, and not much in between of that. Interesting part is that when we look at the voters, the younger the voters, the more distance they are towards bipolar political world, and they are more pluralistic. And I think it is due to the internet. And the third thing, Ivan's question, how can we compete with this sport reality that peace is introducing into politics? I will say what I am using in my arguments with Law and Justice and my talks with Law and Justice voters. I'm asking them if they want to be the underdogs when they lose. What will happen when you lose? How can you think of yourself as a losers in Poland? You won't win forever. We should rather build the reality that is acceptable to both sides or many sides. And I can say that I believe that that it is somehow appealing. And the other argument is that when you give so much power to your leader, there is always always a problem of too much power consolidated in one hand. And you will suffer out of it. You will suffer out of this consolidation of power of Kaczynski because you will lose control over him once, and it will be a disaster. And I think this is also important as in this situation, we are treating Law and Justice voters as partners of rational conversation, of rational discourse. And I think it is a real path to get out of the politics of contempt, from the politics of hierarchization, of winning for all sake. And it brings us towards more democratic and participatory order.
And yes, my mic is on. Jarosław, Tomek, who of you would like to take the floor?
You? Well, the question, Ivan's question, I would treat like Maciek as a practical one, and in fact, at the same time, I will try to reply to Tim's remark, make a comment. Well, in fact, not only pluralism became problematic in Poland, but also an independent way of thinking. You've mentioned the nation as a point of reference for liberals. I wrote a piece on that for Przegląd Polityczny, so this monthly associated with Donald Tusk, and the point is that when you do it after 2015 and you try to change the mindset on the liberal side, well, the point is that the reactions are very violent. Because with this duopole, this bipolar political scene, the heritage political language is full of insults and accusations of the high treason. You know, it's not a joke. I mean, every inch of trying to move the liberal discourse to somewhere else. I tried I wrote a piece on the free movement of people, liberalism and COVID-19. And then I received emails, how could you? You know, this is absolutely, then you try to be a plural in the true meaning of the word. Again, the accusations of treasoning your political side cannot be just dismissed as something that, okay, life goes on. Something like this happens. It comes from very serious people. It comes too often, and it cannot be simply ignored, because in fact it created a kind of a space, and I'm even surprised that we haven't used that word that was so present after 2015. This is the word that is obviously readable for the minority, for intellectuals, but it was widely used. Symmetrism, the beautiful neologism that was created, in fact, to dismiss people who would like to think independently. I mean, it was used in so many contexts, in so many variants, that in fact you cannot just be very precise. So this basic it was treated as an insult, full stop. But so if we are asking ourselves what to do, I think that to nonetheless to practice this non-conformism, intellectual non-conformism, to ask those questions is something that not only I feel condemned to do, because I cannot do it otherwise, sorry, but the point is that what is wonderful about that is the fact that it strikes me how often I see the openness among guys who are from my generation or lower. We are open to those discussions. It is really justified to treat what we have after 2015 as the violence of that fight. To some extent, of course, it won't explain everything, but to some extent as the last fight of dissidents, the last fight that is of anti-politics, that is very violent, full of moralism, and full of symbolic violence, because it's like, okay, so this is the last moment. We are writing the books of history, and who is going to be highlighted? I mean, that to some extent it explains the violence of politics of symbols in political discourse of Poland. Who is going to stay in an encyclopedia? Who is going to have a statue? In the whole world, we are abolishing statues. In Poland, we have new ones, more and more. So I think that this is like a very practical challenge to fight with this, what William Galston named this anti-pluralism. I think this is a serious problem in Poland, and it won't be solved. Our cultural codes, when we have a crisis, we have a set of cultural codes that takes us back to the situation when normality is not the normality with the state. It is like you have the nation, you have the nation that is above the law, above the state. You don't need the compromise. The compromise is the word that is always suspicious in the occupation mentality. So I think that what we should do, and we try to do with the fact that we are publishing this book is to get out of the box that was in fact inherited, and it is not only about dissidents, it's about 200 years. And maybe seizing this opportunity, we could at least brief and maybe do some steps towards the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jarosław. Last but not least, Tomasz.
Okay, so three very short remarks on what Timothy Garton Ash said. Firstly, I would agree with the remark on the title of the book, because probably the liberal mind lives on would be better, since the proof is in the pudding or in the book. And the second, why the polarization was why there was such a significant polarization in the time of crisis in Poland. And my response would be that it is not the case that it so much happened to Poland as it was manufactured by Kaczynski, because he wanted to use the crisis to secure an overwhelming electoral victory. So it's explainable purely in the language of political interests, because if the election could be organized and happened on the 10th of May, Andrzej Duda probably would win in the first round and the whole story would be over. So the radicalization of conflict in a time of crisis is just Kaczynski's standard method of operation. And then third point, what is the magic word? Well, Trzaskowski tried kind of this strategy of a new magic word, and he tried to call his program New Solidarity. So this is a theme which is kind of similar of what you said. But what is interesting here is the reason why he did this. Because first of all the polls show that there is very little chance of people changing camps from peace to civic platform or the other way around. So he didn't do this to persuade new voters or to persuade voters from the other camp. He only did this to demobilize the voters of the peace camp. Because if he said that he will not stop the social benefits and he would say that he would continue some of the peace policies, then some of the voters that were in some way critical of the peace government, or maybe not so much enthusiastic of their actions, would just stay at home. So this was designed to lower the turnout. And now, looking from this practical perspective, maybe I would think that the magic words could be security or solidarity. These would be my two bets. But since you mentioned liberty, this notion might also play a role in these elections, but in an unlikely manner. And this is because Trzaskowski will certainly want to appeal to the voters of far-right Konfederacja, and many of them are enthusiastic about free market liberty. So Trzaskowski will then say that he is the candidate of the free market and of the economic liberty, whereas Duda is the socialist. And this is how he will want to win some of the voters of the far right.
Thank you so much for those closing remarks. And at the same time, thank you to everybody who joined us today. I think it has been a marvelous discussion, and truly I'm extremely pleased that we are starting the life of this book this way. Please feel free to follow on Timothy's thought. Please feel free if you think this book is worth recommending to anybody who would like to understand not only Poland but also populism, to mention it to this person. So thank you so much for today, and have a good and peaceful evening.
You can see about the different title for the second edition. the twist of the liberal mind.
To comment on that, we actually had a discussion about it in Kultura Liberalna, because normally, if you look our issues, normally the subject of the week, which is the main part of the weekly, has always a question mark. So there was a whole discussion in the editorial team: should we have a question mark this time or not?
Frank Fukuyama also had a question mark, but nobody remembered the question mark.
Yes, never. The end of history question mark. Never have a question mark. Failing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us.